welcomes to everyone here. Usually I start by asking who's Irish, but I'm going to switch this just a little bit. Who is not Irish? Okay, that's a fair number of you. Guess what? It's March. We claim you all. Everyone gets to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day, and it is something to think about. I mean, is there anyone in here who is planning on not celebrating St. Patrick's Day? Okay, all those hands that just went up a second ago, for those of you in the front, are now like silently down. And we do have to recognize St. Patrick's Day is a huge, not only a celebration here in New York, obviously we've had a parade since 1766. 150,000 people typically march in that parade. Millions more watch it, whether in person or on TV. But we also have to recognize St. Patrick's Day is a worldwide event. And it is something to recognize how much Irish culture has influenced New Yorkers' lives, American lives, and just kind of worldwide. Today, Irish dancing is a recognizable dance form. Come on, we made it to the Folgers coffee commercials. You know, you've hit it big time when you make it to Folgers there. But it is this idea that it is recognized. You have music. You know, groups like U2 and the Cranberries have been global hits. River dance is a worldwide phenomenon that has, had multiple shows come out of that one. And it is something to recognize how many people claim Irish heritage. Here in the United States, 50 million Americans claim Irish ancestry. Another 50 million people outside of the United States and Ireland claim Irish heritage. So you're looking at around 100 million people going, hello, we are Irish and proud. And yet, Ireland, at its very largest population at the beginning of the 19th century, only had a population of about 8 million. Okay, so we do know how to reproduce. Let's recognize that. But it is something to really kind of recognize that this very tiny island has had an absolutely enormous impact, not only on its country, but very much on what we think of often as an American identity, as a New York identity. And we're going to talk more about this. So I figured I'd throw a map up here in case anyone was not overly familiar for those non-Irishmen in here. Couple things to keep in mind to just give you a sense of size. For those of you who have not traveled through Ireland, you can fit Ireland 9 times into Texas and have some extra room. You can also, it takes longer to go from Queens to Montauk than it is to go from the east coast of Ireland to the west coast of Ireland. So this very tiny island has had an enormous impact, not only today, but definitely historically. Going back to the 8th century BC, we actually believe Ireland may have been one of the wealthiest places in the world. You had huge kind of literature coming out at this period, kind of creative spirits. You have bronze musical instruments that were found from this time period. And one of the things that really truly makes this country unique in Europe's history is that it was never absorbed into the Roman Empire. So much of what we think of as some of the roots of modern Irish culture potentially go all the way back to the Bronze Age and are unique compared to kind of the assimilation that took place elsewhere in Europe. Now, we do know assimilation did take place because in the 5th century AD, Christianity does arrive in Ireland. We celebrate this gentleman's holiday. How many of you are going to be wearing green on St. Patrick's Day? Put your hands down. That is not the color of St. Patrick. Who knows the color of St. Patrick? Okay, I've got to pick on this. She raised her hand really fast. Blue. Blue. So wear your blue on St. Patrick's Day. Green, we'll let you slide. It's the color of Ireland. But it is something to notice. You can usually identify St. Patrick's statues because it will have a blue undercoat on it. When he and his other Christian missionaries arrived in Ireland, they found an already very spiritual island that had a very strong presence. And we do have to recognize that Irish Christianity really became unique in this period of time in Europe. Because typically when we study Christianity in Europe, we think about things like throw the Christians to the lions. You don't have that happening in Ireland. You actually don't have an Irish martyr until the 17th century. When Christianity arrived, it was absorbed in, and there's a phrase that's often used in Irish scholarship, that people and ultimately ideas become more Irish than the Irish themselves. And there's an element of that within Christianity. Christianity was absorbed in, but ultimately absorbed much of the Celtic culture that was already there. And when Rome fell, we get what's often termed the Dark Ages in Europe. This was a period of Irish scholarship that took place. You had works of art like the Book of Kells, which is an illuminated manuscript, that were being created. Irish Christianity was celebrational. We did not have that idea of brimstone and fire. You were not going to be damned to hell, but it was about celebrating what you believed in. And by the 10th century, as Europe is slowly rebuilding itself, European courts did not think that they were complete without having an Irish philosopher, an Irish poet in their courts. Because the Irish definitely went out and they wandered. They brought their culture to other places. I had the luck to actually go to a Celtic conference in Lublin, Poland. And it is actually the largest Celtic conference in Europe. And I went there, and very few people spoke English, but they all spoke Irish. And it was like, what country did I just go to? And it's because back in the 10th century, a bunch of wandering Irish monks landed in Poland. And that was not unusual to have kind of their ideas being spread throughout. And so what we're going to take a look at today is Irish immigration to the United States, and really kind of specifically looking at our neck of the woods, our area here in New York. And we do have to recognize Irish immigrants came for a variety of reasons. Some of them came for economic opportunities. Some of them came so that they could practice their religion. Some came because they would have died of starvation otherwise. No matter why they came, there was definitely a hardship to it. We do have to recognize the idea of leaving Ireland and crossing the Atlantic, whether it was in the 17th century or the 19th century, was seen as permanent. Today, we often, I think, forget how very far away Ireland would have been at this time period. And so when they left, they often were thrown parties. And one of the kind of ideas that comes out of immigration to the United States is the idea of an American wake. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a wake. It's an Irish tradition of celebrating someone who has passed on, celebrating their life. But it does kind of bring home this idea that when immigrants left, they were not going to see their loved ones, that there was not a fond return coming forward. And so they came and they arrived in New York. Obviously, we know they arrived along the eastern seaboard, but New York gains a lot of dominance in a large part for very basic reasons. If you look at the currents, if you just look at how the ocean flows, New York is where you're going to end up. This is going to be one of the critical spots there. And the fact is, the Irish didn't wait for New York, for the United States to welcome them. They took it on their own terms. And we're going to talk about how they often dominated New York politics. They helped to build New York in quite a literal sense. We can look at the lists of people who helped to build the Croton Aqueduct, Central Park, the Brooklyn Bridge. You can look at that next generation of immigrants, or even the children of those earlier Irish immigrants, and they helped build the Empire State Building. And their grandchildren and great-grandchildren will continue to be a voice here in New York. We remember that fateful day back in September 2001, and we recognize how many members of the police departments, the fire departments, that today still have Irish heritage. We remember this when we watch, the St. Patrick's Day parade, and about every other unit is either a fire department or a police department marching. The Irish have been involved in the building of our city quite literally. And one of the things that I want you to think about is that New Yorkers definitely are known for a little attitude. Anyone in here got New York attitude? No. We're keeping our eyes on that one. You probably have maybe that little bit of an accent, and I admit, not a native New Yorker. I'm going to try to keep the y'all down. I'm not even from the state, from Ohio, so I apologize now if you get weird accents coming out here. But everyone recognizes the New York accent. I take students over to Ireland, and as soon as they get off the plane, people are like, oh, you're from New York. They're like, how did you pick out? That accent is distinct. Whether you're from Brooklyn, the Bronx, here in Manhattan, and they've done linguistic studies, the base of the New York accent is the Irish accent. So literally, the Irish have given voice to New Yorkers at the same time that they've helped to build the city, that we've helped to shape the city and who we are. So what I want to do today is take a little bit of a, I will admit, quick tour through Irish immigration to New York. And to look at how it's celebrated, whether in verse, in song, in dance, ultimately. And there's a quote from an Irish poet that I always feel is kind of important to think about. And Brendan Keneally says, all songs are living ghosts that long for a living voice. So I'm hoping tonight we can give voice to our Irish ancestors who helped to build this incredible city and ultimately to build our country. So what we're going to talk about to begin with, and we're going to do it through a mix of songs and poems and storytelling, because that's what good history really is to look at what we often term kind of the two waves of Irish immigration. The first wave of Irish immigration starts right at the very founding of the New York colony. So the first wave is in the 17th century. And most of the immigrants coming from Ireland in the 17th century were young, Catholic, and male. They typically came as individuals, and most of them were coming for economic opportunity. They were hoping to find that small piece of land that they could claim for their own that would allow them to have some stability as they go forward. And one of the things we have to recognize is when we talk about leaving one's country, we talk about this idea of emigration. And someone who leaves a country and arrives becomes an immigrant. In Old Irish, there is actually no word for immigrant. They used a word called dairy. And what it means is exile. And I think in many ways that sums up the experience of those Irish men and women who left in the 17th century, but ultimately also left in the later centuries. That this was permanent, that there was no return. Now, as you get through the 1600s, you have basically small groups of young single men that for the most part are coming over. They are hoping to find fame, fortune, and sweet liberty, as the emigrant's farewell so sums up. They were often very unaware of the trials that they were going to face. They came over very optimistic, as it kind of shows in this poem. The cost of crossing the Atlantic from Ireland to New York in the 17th century into the early 18th century was about 6 months to a year's worth of labor. So this was definitely something that you saved up for. When they crossed, they were typically on ships that were damp, insect-infested, poor food. Many of these early immigrants did not survive the trip. They were buried at sea, and we have no record of what happened to them. And once they arrived, they did arrive, and we have to recognize, into a world that was very much British and very much was Protestant. And most of these young men, for the most part, in order to survive, gave up their religion, gave up their cultural ties. It was about survival and assimilation. But we are going to start to see a change as you get into the beginning of the 18th century. You're going to get a group that is often termed the Redemptionists, or the Scotch-Irish. Now, the Scotch-Irish, for those of you who aren't familiar, were actually Scottish transplants that were, in many ways, planted in Ireland. It goes back to the 17th century, when Ireland was under what we call the penal laws. It's the attempt to eradicate Irish culture and ultimately Catholicism. And so what England decided to do was they wanted to make Ireland a Protestant country. And so they were going to plant Protestants to spread that religion. Now, England often looks and tries to get the most bang for the buck, as we could say. And they also recognized that those Scotsmen were kind of a thorn in their side, quite literally. So what they decided to do was they got rid of many of the Scottish and took them over and put them in Ireland. And this becomes the roots of what we think of as the Scotch-Irish culture. It is a blending of kind of backgrounds. It also has a lot of significance when we think about Irish history. This is the roots of what we often think of as the divide between Northern Ireland and the Republic, as you have different cultures, different kind of personalities when it comes to economics to politics coming out. The Scotch-Irish, though, did recognize that even though they were Protestant in Ireland, they were still what we would think of as second-class citizens. They were Protestant, but not Church of England. And so many of them will ultimately emigrate to the colonies. And what they're looking for is, first of all, to get as far away from the English as possible. But they also want their chance to own their own land without any of kind of that bureaucracy over them. And many of them come with entire families, even entire communities are going to leave Ireland coming here. And they first arrive mainly in the New York area, and they tend to push out. They go into what we often think of as the backcountry of the 13 colonies of the time, so think western Pennsylvania, and ultimately spread down through the Appalachian Mountains. And they very much start to shape the cultures of that area. Much of what we think of as Appalachian culture has its roots in, really, Ireland. Some of you, maybe as kids or maybe more recently, how many of you have ever done a little square dancing? Probably one of the most common dances people tend to learn, mainly because it's the easiest to teach a large group. As a dance teacher, I can admit to that. Is what's known as the Virginia reel. It's basically men line up on one side, women line up on the other, and you do basically a turnaround. It's actually the haymaker's jig. It's a very old Irish dance that ultimately got assimilated in as they blended in. And ultimately, the Scotch-Irish are going to have an enormous role to play when you fast forward to the last part of the 18th century and that moment of the American Revolution. For those of you who've studied the American Revolution, it did not start off too well. In August 1776, Battle of Brooklyn, George Washington lost New York. Kind of went downhill after that. You get Valley Forge, it's not looking good. One of the strengths, though, that will come out in the next year or so is when the Mountain Men of Virginia arrive. Mountain Men of Virginia were the Scotch-Irish. They were known to be able to shoot the eye of a running squirrel at 300 yards. I can't even see a squirrel at 300 yards, let alone where their eye is, let alone shoot it. And while that may be a slight exaggeration, we do have to recognize that these were men that lived on the frontier. They hunted for their livelihood. And ultimately, it's these men who start to turn the tide for the patriots in battle. And so, again, the Irish immigrants are going to have an enormous impact on what we think of as, modern American history. And one of the things that we'll see is that the Irish put much of their struggles into song. And part of that has to do with the fact that there is such a large attempt to rid them of their culture, to take away their political rights. So the best way to protest was often through song, through poetry. I will never forget on the bright rosy morn, when old Ireland I left, how my poor heart did mourn. When my blessed old mother said be of good cheer, goodbye, Michael darling, farewell, mother dear. Then my brothers and sisters took me by the hand and bade me do right when I left Ireland. I bade them goodbye at our cottage door. I left Ireland and mother because we were poor. The one thing to keep in mind was they saw, whether it was the colonies or later the United States, as a land of opportunity, a place that would give them a chance. And we're continuing to see this idea of opportunities in the song, The Green Fields of America. This is one of the most widely sung songs of Irish immigration, and besides being a literal description, it very much is about the opportunities that America is going to give to the Irish as they come here. And so we do have to recognize that this first wave had high hopes. Now, as I said, we often kind of separate the immigration into two waves. The first wave of the 17th and 18th century. The second wave is very much coming out of the middle part of the 19th century. What is termed the Irish Famine. From 1845 to 1851, a blight struck Ireland and basically destroyed the potato crop 5 of those 6 years. It was absolutely deadly. 1.5 million people died, and at least another 1.5 million emigrated. At first they emigrated to places like England, Canada, but ultimately the United States accepted the largest number, with most of them coming into New York, as well as places like Boston and Philadelphia. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. The blight that hit the potatoes actually started here in the United States. We shipped it over to Ireland, and it is something to recognize. The blight is actually still around. If any of you remember from about 2 summers ago when the potato prices spiked, it was because of the same blight from the 19th century. But it went to Europe, and it actually devastated the entire potato crops in Belgium. How many of you have ever heard of the Belgium potato famine? That's because while they lost the crops, people did not die of starvation in the same way that they did in Ireland. We have to recognize by the 19th century, 2/3 of the Irish were absolutely dependent on the potato for their main sustenance. They basically ate potatoes, maybe a little bit of cream or buttermilk to add to it. And we do also have to recognize that, I know today we're often told, don't eat too much potatoes. How many of you have been told to cut the carbs out? If you eat the whole potatoes, I'm going to have a lot of doctors mad at me on this one, it's actually quite healthy. You get a slew of necessary vitamins. You get vitamins A, C, and D from eating the potato. And we do have to recognize, in the beginning of the 19th century, the Irish were actually considered the healthiest population in Europe. This did lead to a lot of issues. It led to a massive growth in their population size. And so you will see, by the time of the famine, a population of a little over 8 million. With them being absolutely dependent for 2/3 of their community, the potato famine is going to have enormous consequences. Now, the reason that the Ungantamor, the Great Hunger as it's known, is so very controversial is that while the potato crop was wiped out, none of the other production of food had been touched. And Ireland actually was exporting enough food that they could have fed their population during this time of starvation. But due to economics, British government policies, all of that was being shipped out, often under the eye of the British Army. And you're going to have a mass change in Irish society, Irish culture. Those who were most dependent on the potato were at the lowest socioeconomic levels. And those who managed to survive, many of them were forced to leave Ireland and come to the States, or whether to Canada or other places. What many of the landlords felt was that it was actually cheaper to get rid of their tenants and put sheep on the land instead. And one of the fears was that tenants would come back. And so what they often did was they would basically set fire to the roofs, and they would knock down at least one of the walls to make these places unlivable. But they also paid, the cheapest price possible, of course, to literally rid Ireland of these people. And they were sent over on ships, many of which became known as the Coffin Ships. These were basically the cheapest ships available. One of the things to recognize is that wooden boats actually have a very short lifespan. Usually they're only good for about 20 to 30 years, but many of the owners of these vessels were looking for extra money, and so many of the Coffin ships were actually 40, 50 years old. And so they really were not particularly seaworthy. They'd hit a storm, you're in the North Atlantic. They also took some of the worst water. One of the things that they often did to save money on the waters was they'd use old wine containers to put the water in. The water went bad, and thus it would be a struggle. And so many people lost their lives. But it was about coming to the States. And one of the things to keep in mind in the 19th century, and it's a phrase I'm sure many of you have heard, the streets were lined with gold. Now, have any of you found any of these streets lined with gold here in Manhattan? If you'd like to tell me after the talk, I promise I won't tell anyone. And we do have to recognize that those who arrived still felt that it was often a better opportunity from what they had left behind. The struggles were so very difficult. Now, one thing that we often forget, when we think about like Italians who come in like the 1880s, we recognize they did not speak English. We tend to forget that the Irish immigrants of this period also did not speak English. Most of them were speaking Irish. And one of the things to keep in mind that the famine causes is really a mass loss in the speaking of the Irish language. Anyone in here know Gaelic? We need to work on that. There are actually plenty of schools, and I will be more than willing to tell people where they are, that are trying to teach it. Less than 80,000 people today are fluent in Irish. If you go to school in Ireland, you actually do learn it from knee-high all the way through high school. But I'm sure, how many of you took a language in high school? How many of you remember? It's like I talk to my college students, I'm like, oh, you took Spanish. And they're like,
exactly.
Hola? And I'm like, anything else? Ciao? And I'm like, wrong language. It simply hasn't stuck. Today there is a much bigger shift. There's more bilingual schools. And again, much of the shift is actually coming from outside of the country to help re-energize this language, because it was the poorest who spoke Irish. And those were either the ones who unfortunately perished or who left. And ultimately, in assimilating into New York culture, learned English. And so we do see this kind of coming out. Now, one of the kind of most poignant thoughts to come out, how many of you have looked for your ancestry? I know Ancestry.com is enormous here. Ancestry.com actually says about a quarter of everyone that goes on that site is specifically looking for Irish ancestry. How many of you have gone on and then you get kind of stuck? You get back to like 1870s, 1860s, and then there's nothing. And a large part of that has to do with the famine records, that as these populations became mobile, community Bibles became mobile, and as people passed away, the Bibles were often lost. It also has to do, unfortunately, with a loss of archival records. Both here in New York as well as in Ireland, we had 2 major archives burned down because we put everything together for safekeeping. We're working on that part of it. But it is actually quite often, and it's simply because the records disappear as people shifted. And this is kind of a poignant reminder of that. When you come to look for your family roots, ask for the famine field. There's likely one in every parish or corner of some great estate now ruined. The land staked out by tenants who survived to make their claim. Not everyone will tell you where they are, but you can tell. The darker grass, the land sunk beneath the fields above, but you will know if any one of yours is buried there. And in many ways, it's actually a very literal description. If you travel to Western Ireland, if you go into parts of Galway, Mayo, you'll actually see what are known as lazy beds. And they are the potato beds that were planted but were never picked because either their planters died or had left the country. And you can still literally see the lines in the earth. You'll also still see many of the cottages. I take students over on a regular basis for the study abroad program, and I've talked to a lot of people in different communities, and one of the things that they often say is that if you have a famine cottage, a cottage from this period, you do not ever knock it down, because you never know when someone is going to come back hoping to find some piece of their Irish heritage, that you don't necessarily restore it, but you don't do any more damage to it. And it is kind of that poignant reminder of what was left behind. But in our case, we're actually quite interested in what was here. And the Irish arrived, and we know that basically from the famine period toward about the next 75 years, about 5 million Irish immigrants arrived in New York. And the majority of those who arrived here stayed in New York for the very practical reason of they couldn't afford to leave. That they were the poor, that they were often uneducated, they were unskilled, and that arriving here, that this was going to be their final destination. And they often took great hope in the idea that this was a land of opportunity, until they faced the massive prejudice. And one of the things to recognize is that we often, when we study early American history, we talk about how the early 13 colonies were shaped by British culture. Part of that cultural baggage that they brought with them was their prejudice against the Irish and the stereotypes. They saw the Irish as other. What's the opposite of white? Black. It's one of the different backgrounds of where the term Black Irish comes from. And it simply is the idea that they were not English, that they were other. And so there was massive prejudice against them. And probably many of you are familiar with the phrase, "no Irish need apply." You definitely saw it in some of the ads, where it was very specific that when they were looking for a maid or a cook, that they would specifically say, "no Irish need apply." And we know that that prejudice existed. There is, however, some misnomers here. And I want to go back to that earlier sign. You will actually find these signs in some of the antique shops here in Manhattan. And I would challenge you guys to flip them over. Because when they say made in London, there's a problem. Because what New Yorker would need a sign shipped all the way from London? And let me be clear, the signs did exist, but not in the numbers that our Irish American mythology has kind of emphasized. The prejudice was there. One of the great things about Manhattan is how very well documented it is. There are thousands of pictures going right back to this period in the 19th century. And you can look at the storefronts of New York City, and you're not going to see these signs prominently displayed. It's not to say that prejudice wasn't there, and I'm not saying that there wasn't any signs. But we do have to recognize part of our prejudice and part of our history as an immigrant culture ultimately takes on a larger group. These signs were very, very common in London. If you look at London, which is again another city that was incredibly well documented at this period, you will see the signs in almost every storefront from this period. And some of it we have to recognize is proximity to Ireland. But the prejudice definitely came. And when the Irish arrived, they, as I said, were already illiterate, unskilled, and they faced absolutely crushing squalor. But many of them definitely tried to send help home. We have a letter from Martin O'Gara. He was a ditch digger here in the city, and he said, "My dear wife, do not fret that I have forgotten you and our little ones. I have steady work, and I do not drink away my wages, but have saved 5 pounds, which I now send you to feed the children. With the help of God in my next letter, I will pay your passage and bring you all to join me in this land of plenty." Even with everything they faced, it is something that we have to recognize. They still saw it as a better opportunity than what they had left behind. And approximately 60% of all Irish immigrants arriving in America did stay here in New York, and they created what often became known as shanty towns or paddy towns. 5 Points is probably the most famous here in New York. One of the things to keep in mind is quite often the Irish lived right on top of the water. I know today we tend to think of closer to the water, waterfront property. It tends to get a little more pricey. In the 19th century, that was the opposite way. The water was associated with cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all those fun diseases. And so the poorest of the poor lived in those areas. And diseases like those, as well as tuberculosis, ran rampant. Irish infants had the highest mortality of any infant group in the United States. And we do have to recognize the struggles that they faced. Most male Irish immigrants, when they arrived, typically only survived another 10 years here in the United States. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that they were already often weakened. So they came, they're attempting to find work, so they're working outside, they're ditch digging, they're building canals, they're facing kind of extreme weather conditions. You also have poor living situations that are coming on, and we do also have to recognize the role of alcoholism in it. Now, there is a certain irony, and it's one that I often get on my students about because St. Patrick's Day has kind of been associated with, well, heavy drinking. Which is why I'm actually on spring break, because Stony Brook never has classes around St. Patrick's Day. And it's something that St. Patrick is probably rolling over in the grave. St. Patrick is actually one of our really interesting saints from that period, because we actually have 2 of his own writings. We have his autobiography, and we also have a letter to a contemporary hero that he very bluntly says, stop drinking, stop whoring, stop partying. So St. Patrick is turning over in the grave with what we've done to St. Patrick's Day over here. But the reason I wanted to highlight it is the Irish do get associated with alcoholism, the idea of the drunken Irishman. But there's actually a much kind of deeper pervasive issue here. If you are ditch digging, I'm going to pick on this gentleman just because you're in the front here. Does ditch digging sound fun?
No.
No? He was quite adamant. Canal builder? Yeah? No? Okay. You guys really aren't. Keep in mind, this is what you'd be doing 6 days a week from sunup to sundown, 52 weeks a year. How do I get him to come back on Monday? Well, it's actually a practice that goes back to Europe in the Middle Ages. They would often pay journeymen half their wages in alcohol. So I'm going to pay you some alcohol along with the money, and by the way, you drunken slop. They just don't. There's kind of this dichotomy that comes out. They're paying them, recognizing the role alcohol has to play in getting people to forget, oh my God, how bad was last week. At the same time, they're going, you should not be drunken, you should not be misbehaving here. So there's definitely kind of a push and a prejudice that's coming out. Now, ladies, you have it slightly better. Because while you, again, are coming off the ships often weekend, you are not going to be working outside. Irish female immigrants basically took over the servants' roles, whether they were the cooks, parlor maids, nannies. And this is actually a picture from the 19th century from Castle Garden. So after Ellis Island opened, Castle Garden was the earlier immigration center. It became an employment center. People who were looking for help could go down and I could go, can you cook? I'm not really confident on that one. Can you cook? Okay, we will hire you. You're too pretty to be the parlor maid. I'd have to worry about my husband on that one. But they could come down and they could find potential jobs this way. And so it did give a certain amount of security. And we do recognize that by 1880, 87% of the unskilled labor in New York City was taken by the Irish. Now, ladies, don't think that you have it all easy compared to the gentlemen. We do to what they saw as a land of opportunity. Others chose to fight so they could bring that skill set back to Ireland in order to overthrow the English, the rise of nationalism. But many chose to fight to prove they could be American, to show their patriotism. And so they did sign up in huge numbers, and ultimately it is a period of great Irish pride. Some of you may be familiar with any Notre Dame fans in here? We've got the Fighting Irish? Okay, good. The reason Notre Dame is actually known as the Fighting Irish is one of the chaplains that helped to found that university was the chaplain for the Fighting 69th. It was a New York City division mainly made up of Irishmen. The 69th Division fought in every major battle of the Civil War, and they became known for wearing shamrocks in their hats, so they were easily identifiable. And their bravery and heroic actions started to really help change a nation's perception of who the Irish were. They were seen as being able to be patriotic. Now, we do have to recognize that when the Civil War first started, it was thought that it would be a quick war. Both the Union and the Confederacy thought that, and ultimately it dragged on. And by 1863, New York, which had been huzzah in the beginning, was starting to go, huzzah, whoop-de-doo-dah, we want our economy back. Because the Civil War was very hard on our trading economy. And so you start to have fewer and fewer people volunteering. And you're going to have a draft put into place in the summer of 1863. And the way the draft worked is twofold. First of all, Lincoln would basically say each state needs to provide X amount of people. If it's not met through recruitment, then you will have a draft in those states. The other part to keep in mind is who can get drafted. Once you're drafted, you have two options. You can go to fight, or you can actually pay someone else to go to fight. But in order to do that, you're going to need some money, which means the Irish are less likely to be able to afford that. Now, before this draft had occurred, in January of 1863, you have the signing of a very famous document, the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. How many of you remember hearing about that in school? Who remembers what it actually is? This is like the pop quiz time. I had one hand go up.
I mean, it was pretty much a military order, taking the Southerners' assets, proclaiming that the African Americans in the South are free.
Yeah, what it does is it frees those slaves in states in open rebellion. Which means if you're a slave in Kentucky, which stayed in the Union, you're still a slave. You also do have to keep in mind that if you're in the Confederacy, are you paying any attention to what Lincoln tells you to do? This actually had a lot with keeping England out of the Civil War. It was a political move that very much put the emphasis on slavery and on the idea that there was a moral cause being fought here. And this became actually very controversial here in New York with the Irish population. The Irish had been at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, along with the next largest group, which is the African Americans. And no one wants to be on the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder. You always want at least one person underneath you that you can stand on. And the Irish and Black communities had very much kind of struggled here. And you actually see this playing out in different ways. How many of you have been to Madison Square Garden? Probably went for a concert or maybe for a sports event. The roots of Madison Square Garden actually starts with dancing. It used to be where they would have dance-offs, mainly between Irishmen and African Americans. And the dance-off wasn't about how good of a dancer you were. It was about how many dances you could do. So she would do one, I'd do another. She'd do a different one, I'd do a different one. Whoever had the most dances became the champions. And it started with a little kind of opening, get people excited, had a little boxing match. And then came the dance-offs. And these were often dance-offs that were across state lines. If she was from South Carolina, I may have called her out and had her come up for this dance-off. So there was a lot of competition between these two groups that were going on. And by the 1860s, the Irish had managed to dominate the maritime trades, and they will continue to dominate those right into the beginning of the 20th century. And they pushed African Americans out of it. But there was still a lot of tensions between these two groups, which brings us to the summer of 1863. New York does not meet its recruitment numbers. And so they have a draft in which 1,200 names are read. And the Irish felt that there were too many O's and Mic's on the list. And they rioted. In 1 week's time, they did almost $5 million of damage to our lovely city here. And more importantly, they very much changed that growing opinion of the Irish as being able to be good Americans. It got to the point that the Union Navy actually shot a cannonball into Manhattan in order to quell the riots. Now, there's a lot of debate about how many people were involved, how many people died. The estimates are around 50,000 people were involved in these riots. We really don't have a good idea of how many died. Most of them who did were buried kind of off on the sides. There wasn't a lot of publicity around it. Ultimately, only 20 people are ever brought up on charges. The bigger outcome was ultimately that the Irish were again seen as troublesome, as not melding into the Irish communities here. And so there is this question of should they go and fight for Lincoln? But ultimately they're going to still hold true. One of the kind of fun stories that comes out of this period of the Civil War and later on is evidently, I will have to say, and I went to Catholic schooling, they did not teach really good geography because a bunch of Irish New Yorkers thought that they could capture Canada. And so they actually invaded Canada 3 different times between the Civil War and the mid-1870s to take it hostage, to hold it for Ireland's freedom. Evidently it didn't work out too well. Let's recognize that one. But it was the belief, and this is something to keep in mind, that as much as they're fighting to be American, they are not forgetting their Irish heritage as they go forward. And they are going to continue to kind of rebuild. Sorry, I'm going through these so that we don't die of fumes here. Kind of attempt to rebuild what was going on. One of the ways they did that was by very much getting involved in politics. Probably many of you have heard of Tammany Hall. Boss Tweed himself was not Irish, but his successors were. And if you look at urban politics, whether it's here in New York, in Boston you had Big Tom Sullivan, Chicago had the same areas, then the Irish got involved in politics in order to help themselves out. And the politics of the time was actually described by one of Tweed's henchmen, who was an Irishman, Richard O'Gorman, who said that American urban politics was a filthy pool of shabbiness, falsehood, and corruption. And many argued that it was the Irish conquest of our cities. The Irish, though, saw it as a way to survive. And it is at this period of time that we see the Irish entering the police forces and the fire departments in such large numbers. It starts to give them stability. It starts to give them pride in their community, in their city, and ultimately in their adopted country. And we're going to continue to see this kind of push going on. And one of the things that happens as you get into the 20th century is the question of what is an Irish American. As you get into the period of 1900, we can look at the census. 2/3 of those who are labeled Irish American are actually born here in the United States. Yet you still have around 30,000 Irishmen arriving every year. So there's still a very large population. But many of them are starting to want to kind of drop the Irish identity and really kind of emphasize the American identity. They start to leave organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians. This is when groups like the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization that is not specifically Irish or even Italian, starts to kind of rise during this period. Catholicism starts to really have an important role to play in many ways in a quite literal sense. The building of churches, building of St. Patrick's Cathedral, gave jobs to the Irish. At the same time, you also have those Irish parochial schools coming out. In 1920, and I was fascinated by this, 50,000 Irish nuns taught 1.7 million children in 5,400 parochial schools. Education was seen as the way that Irish Americans were going to go forward. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that World War I was a challenge for many Irish Americans. They wanted to prove their patriotism. They wanted to fight with the American army, but that also meant they would be allied with Britain. And while they do choose to join the U.S. Army, they also send huge amounts of monies back to Ireland. Americans will sympathize, leave politics one side, hail into the bright stars and stripes in which the Irish pride. We'll send them food, we'll send them gold, in Congress we have friends. Relief for Ireland, the eagle claps its wings. And Irish Americans took great pride in supporting what ultimately became the fight for independence and with the creation of the Irish Free State in 1921. One of the things, though, that definitely starts to change this idea of Irish nationhood is the 1930s. After the roar of the 1920s, on that fateful day in October 1929, you have the stock market crash, and ultimately the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was, in many ways, a great equal opportunity. Everyone suffered. And what you started to see was not only a return and an emphasis on faith. It's during this period in the 1930s that Irish Catholicism becomes the largest denomination in the United States. You start to see a celebration of what we often think of as kind of Irish charm and Irish qualities of toughness. Maureen O'Hara, James Cagney, Bing Crosby, Jimmy Stewart. I mean, James Cagney becomes the Yankee Doodle Dandy. These become some of the most popular actors and actresses of the time. But it was often what they brought to the screen that was so very attractive. And we do have to recognize that the Irish start to take pride again in not just being American, but being an Irish American. After World War II, in which again the Irish are going to join in huge numbers, you start to see a bigger celebration of Irish culture. The first Irish dance competition, called a Feis, was held in New York, upstate in the mid-1940s at the Roosevelt Estate, upstate. And so it was very stylized. Gentlemen, you would have been dancing with a little shillelagh. But again, it was the idea that you could be American and you could be Irish at the same time. And it is a celebration of where they have come from. Danny Boy is probably one of the most played songs. I would suspect many of you have heard it. And it very much captures a lot of the sadness, the peace, but also the loss that happens when they leave Ireland. And we start to see more and more emphasis on literature. Yeats is coming out. This is all part of the earlier Gaelic or Celtic revival that happened in Ireland of how do you create a nation? You need to create an Irish identity. And you start to see America kind of celebrating those ideas of being Irish and being American. More and more people join local Irish organizations. Though I would like to note, he's playing Scottish bagpipes. Irish bagpipes are played sitting down. But again, what would St. Patrick's Day be without our bagpipes? But you see kind of this push, and celebrations become more common. I live out on Long Island, and pretty much every town on Long Island has a parade. If you drive through the towns now, you're going to see all the green stripes going down the center. And it became much more acceptable to celebrate your Irish culture, your Irish heritage. You can start to dance, and I laughed when I was a kid. I've been dancing since I was 3. It was very uncool. I was not a cool kid when I was a child. But now, I have Irish dancers. I teach out of Babylon. I have a dance school out there. It's cool to do Irish dancing. People are like, hey, we know that. I would argue about a third of my dancers aren't even Irish. And none of my redheads. I'm very disappointed in this. But it is something to recognize that it became part of mainstream culture. Definitely was celebrated in 1994. You have River Dance. And again, the fact that it became a Broadway phenomenon shows how much Irish culture really became part of New York culture, became part of American culture. So I always say, American by birth, Irish by the grace of God. So I'd like to say